Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Intro to Responsible Alpaca Standard. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Any unanswered questions will be answered afterwards via email. Now on to Hannah Deans with Textile Exchange. Hannah?
Thank you. Thank you and welcome to this webinar. With me, I've got Callie Weldon and Anna Heaton, and we're going to be providing an introduction to the development process for the Responsible Alpaca Standard. And Callie is going to give us an overview of alpaca as a fiber, its supply chain, and the geography it's grown in. And Anna is going to provide us with an overview of animal welfare issues related to alpaca. Next slide, please. So for those that are not aware, Textile Exchange has developed a standard for wool, the Responsible Wool Standard, which was released in 2016. And over the past year, we've been working on developing the Responsible Mohair Standard, which was released in March this year. And the work to develop the Responsible Alpaca Standard is being done in a way that aligns with the RWS and the RMS. Next slide, please. So the standard follows the same structure with a farm scope, and at the farm, animal welfare, land management, and social welfare is addressed. And the processing part of the supply chain follows the same model that all Textile Exchange standards use. So the requirements are set out in the content claim standard. And next slide, please. And here's an overview of the structure of the wool standard and the mohair standard, and the same structure that we're approaching this work with the alpaca standard. And Anna is going to go into a little bit more detail around the animal welfare requirements and the animal welfare framework that we're using to help connect different species into one system. Next standard, please. Next slide, please. So we've got a high-level overview of the process that we're going to go through. As we're developing a standard to sit alongside our existing standards, the approach that we're taking is a little bit different to our normal standard development process, but the flow is pretty much the same. So we're in the very early stages of the research and initial stakeholder engagement. And we're just started the work of drafting the requirements that align with this animal welfare framework. The next step in the process, once we have a draft set of requirements developed, is to pilot test the standard on farms. And then we will go back and revise the standard based on the findings from these pilot audits. Once we have arrived at a near final version, we will carry out stakeholder consultation in line with our ICL commitments, and we will also carry out training for certification bodies and their auditors before we finalize and release the standard. So if we go to the next slide, please. I've included some indications of timings here. So as it is a slightly different approach to a completely new standard development, the advantage is that it can go a bit faster than the normal 18-month timeline that you would look at from a completely new standard development approach. However, with the travel restrictions in place at the moment, the timeline is to be determined depending on when travel is possible again to facilitate the pilot audits. So, as I mentioned, we have started the work of the initial research and drafting of the standards, and we expect to have a draft set of requirements ready for piloting in June. And next slide, please. So just to finalize on the process, for those that are interested in being involved, we have got an ongoing international working group in place for the Responsible Animal Fiber Standard, so for the wool and the mohair. And we will be creating an additional group for alpaca stakeholders within that international working group. But I will hand over to Callie now, who will provide a bit of background about alpaca as a fiber.
Great, thanks Hannah for getting us started. Like Hannah mentioned, my name is Callie, and I just wanted to give a brief overview of my background and how I gathered the information for both the presentation and then also helping with the standard development. I think I've met some people who are registered for the webinar, but I'm relatively new to the Textile Exchange team. I've been working in this role for just under a year, but previously I lived in Peru in the Sacred Valley area, and I worked for a nonprofit where I was involved in the alpaca industry on the farm level. And since then, I've spent some extended periods of time traveling back to the area to study the farms and the industry in relation to the global apparel market. So I just wanted to offer this background for my qualifications about talking about this, and I'm really excited that this fiber is going to be part of our portfolio of standards. So jumping right into the fiber characteristics, alpaca is technically classified as a fiber, hair, or fleece. It's sometimes referred to as wool, but for the sake of textile exchange classification, we'll be referring to it as a fiber or a hair. There are two breeds of alpaca. The Surrey alpaca, which you see on the right-hand side, is about 5% of the population, and then the Huacaya alpaca is about 95% of the population. And you might recognize the image on the left as a more popular image when you think of alpaca. The Surrey fibers are finer and softer and compared to cashmere or silk, and the Huacaya fleece is very dense and crimped. You can see in the photo, it's very hard to see the skin of the animal when you pull the fiber apart, meaning it's very dense as it grows. And it's the main textile, or it's the main breed for textile application. Alpacas are naturally bred in 22 shades, so there's a wide variety of natural color available, although most of them are bred in white because it's the easiest color to dye for processing. One fleece will contain multiple diameters of fiber, and they're graded as royal, baby, superfine, fine, medium, strong, and mixed, with the micron grades listed next to them. And these can vary slightly depending on the country and the supplier in terms of the grades, but this is largely what the classifications are listed as. And it should be noted that baby alpaca are it's not actually a baby alpaca being sheared. It's one of the classifications based on the micron. So an alpaca, a 2-year-old alpaca or a 3-year-old alpaca can still have baby microns in their fleece. And it's often found in the chest of the alpaca. Royal and baby grades are typically applied to the luxury apparel market, or they're blended for performance wear. And then the medium, strong, and mixed are used for more durable applications such as carpets, bedding, fill, and insulation. And each time the alpaca is sheared, the fiber diameter will increase slightly for the next year. Jumping into some of the nitty-gritty about the fiber characteristics, you can see on the lower left-hand picture that is a photo of an alpaca fiber under a microscope, and the core of the alpaca fiber has pockets of hollowness. So it has a slightly higher level as compared to wool. And when you think of alpaca, it's traditionally thought of as a very warm fiber, a warm material. And these pockets create pockets to trap air in. So it increases the thermal capacity of being able to hold air. The average tensile strength is about 40% higher than wool, and the single fiber staple strength is about 7% higher than wool. It is a hydrophobic fiber, meaning it's naturally water resistant, not waterproof, but it is moisture wicking, and the water retention rate is about 8%, which is slightly lower than wool, which would be about 16 to 20%. In the image on the lower right-hand side, you can see the scales of the fiber. They're quite small, even compared to cashmere, and this is superfine alpaca, so that is one of the smallest microns. But it means that alpaca traditionally isn't very itchy when you're using it in its pure form, and it's less prone to pilling compared to other animal fibers. It's also lanolin-free, which means that it's hypoallergenic, and it doesn't require the harsh chemical bath in the scouring phase. It does still go through a scouring phase, but it's more of a gentle detergent that's applied. And so this often yields to a higher end product by weight. And in terms of processing, alpaca can be processed both in the worsted and woolen method for yarn. It can also be woven, knitted, and felted. Getting into the supply chain of alpaca, it's very similar to wool. The steps in terms of the processing and the facilities are quite similar. On the farm level, the shearing occurs typically once per year. And one of the only differences is that the fiber categorization largely happens at the first stage processor. So the fiber is taken from the farm to the first stage processor, and it's hand classified, which is a really, really great thing to be able to watch somebody look at a fiber and be able to tell by eye or by hand what micron it is. After that, it goes through very similar processes in terms of the fiber opening to remove the byproducts and the guard fibers, the scouring, like we mentioned before, with the series of gentle detergents, drying and lubrication phase, and then on into your yarn processing, whether you're carding and roving for a woolen yarn or combing and top finishing for a worsted yarn, and then on to the spinning, blending, and knitting, weaving, and dyeing. This diagram is just a brief overview of the actors in the value chain, and we'll talk more about geography and farms in a moment, but for illustrative purposes, this is a chart of the supply chain as it exists in Peru. And Peru is home to the majority of alpaca in the world, and the industry for apparel largely starts here. So I just wanted to point out a few parts of this where you can see that the farmers are divided up into 3 categories, and the majority of farmers in Peru are smallholder, meaning on average they own about 46 alpaca. And so it should just be noted that right now, the majority of fiber in the supply chain is funneling through either collectors or intermediaries before it goes through the first stage processing. You can also see the mention of craftsmen down here, and this group is selling to the home market, which would be the local market in Peru. And there are many craftspeople in Peru who hand spin, hand dye, knit, and weave alpaca as a traditional craft. And so there's a large market within Peru for these items, as well as some that are exported. And then you can also see that the national industry also produces to sell in the home market. And this is for more high-end luxury retail for Peruvians. And jumping into some of the industry trends with exports, you can see in 2018 that the exports were 180 million USD FOB. This is a 23.7% increase compared to 2017 and an annual increase of 10% in the last 7 years, which is interesting because the alpaca population hasn't necessarily increased at that rate, but it's indication that the supply chain has become more and more connected and established for export. When you're looking at the product breakdown, it's mostly carded and combed fiber and yarns, and these are being exported for processing in other countries. And then as you go down the line with some finished clothing and raw fibers, carpets, low quality fiber. The main countries of import listed below, mostly China and Italy, and then some coming to the US, Norway, and so on. In the chart on the right, it's from the Ministry of Agriculture of Peru. It's just a breakdown of the different areas of production in terms of the regions in Peru for alpaca production. So we've mentioned Peru a few times. I'm just going to get into some of the overview of the geography for the alpaca population. There's about 6 million alpaca in the world, and this is an estimate based off the average herd size and the number of farmers who are registered to sell. So this number is from the Census of Agriculture that took place in Peru back in 2012. It's the most recent large-scale survey that's taken place, so the numbers are most likely higher than this currently, but going with this number, the distribution would be 71.7% in Peru, which is the vast majority, and then some living in Bolivia and Australia, and then the US and the EU. And listed below are just a couple of countries that have recognized the potential that this industry has and have made some public announcements about efforts to grow their populations of alpaca, including Australia and China and UK, Germany, New Zealand, and South Africa. So as I mentioned, the alpaca is, excuse me, native to Peru, and it's traditionally considered to be a sacred animal with the Inca population. So you see it depicted in many ancient Andean motifs and weavings and other artworks. So this means it plays an integral role not only in the economy, but also in the cultural identity of the history of the nation. So much so that the alpaca species was declared a genetic resource of Peru with their legal system, and National Alpaca Day is August 1st. It's coming up, mark your calendars. This is a day that promotes alpaca as a part of Peruvian cultural identity and really tries to bring the country together to celebrate modern day Peru with a historic animal species. The production is concentrated in regions that are very high above sea level, 3,800 meters, which is about 12,500 feet. And this is known as the highlands or the altiplano. And 58% of Peru's agricultural land is located at this high altitude. You can see in the map here that the main areas of concentration, so if Lima is about here, the altitude, so Lima would be sea level, the altitude will increase as it gets closer to Bolivia. This is Lake Titicaca, which is, I believe, the highest lake in the world. And the majority of the concentration of the production is surrounding this area. So Puno is at a very high altitude, and that's where about 40% of the population lives. As I mentioned before, most farmers are smallholder, meaning they own on average 46 alpaca or less than 10 hectares of land, although the property lines in the highlands are not officially marked, and the herds tend to share land and space. As I mentioned, the alpaca lives between 3,000 meters, which is 9,000 feet, to anywhere up to 15,750 feet or 4,500 meters. So very, very high. There's 3 seasons that exist, which is rainy, frost, and dry season. So alpaca in a single day can withstand a temperature between -4 degrees Fahrenheit to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -20 Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. And so, of course, at this altitude, there's not a wide variety of plants. I think Anna will touch on this a little bit more later in the presentation, but alpaca eat a low protein diet of mostly grass, about 2 pounds or 1.5% of their body weight per day. A quick intro to the land overview, where we'll elaborate on this topic in further presentations, or if you join the stakeholder group to be a part of this discussion. But alpacas are light grazers, and they do well with native grasses and high in fiber, low in protein. They actually eat by cutting the grass with their teeth as opposed to ripping out the root systems. And in the photo on the left is the bottom of an alpaca foot, and they have soft padded legs as opposed to sheep or goat, which have harder hooves, and so they don't cut into the topsoil as much. And then just a brief number about the static load of an alpaca. Alpacas weigh anywhere between 100 and 200 pounds as an adult, so they have a lighter static load as compared to sheep. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Anna Heaton to talk a little bit more about the animal welfare aspects of alpaca.
Thanks, Callie. Hi, everybody. If I can have the next slide, that'll be great. Just going to do a bit of a intro here. So this is starting, as Hannah said at the beginning of this webinar, this work with alpaca is not like creating an entirely new standard completely from scratch. And we do have a framework for animal welfare, which Textile Exchange has used for the Responsible Wool and the Responsible Mohair Standard. And then just this is a sort of overview and starting point for that is that the textile exchange standards now, we are working with the 5 provisions. Most people are very familiar with the 5 freedoms, which are obviously now, I think, first developed back in the 1960s. And the 5 freedoms do underpin fundamental animal welfare requirements, but in recent years those that have been working in the field of animal welfare have shifted towards the 5 provisions, which, rather than talking about the absence of negatives, is much more about developing and measuring positive animal welfare. And you can see within the provisions, if you like, the headlines and the topics are similar to the 5 freedoms, but as I say, it is much more about the positive outcomes. And then the first 4 domains of nutrition, environment, health and behaviour sort of impact the 5th provision, which is the positive mental experience. So it's sort of the idea of this model is it's a comprehensive evaluation of the animal's positive and negative experiences, and the overall balance of which is giving a welfare status and quality of life. So within the work that we're doing with animal welfare, this is sort of the overarching principle that we're working to. If I can have the next slide, please. So, and then within using the provisions, there is an animal welfare framework, and the aim of the animal welfare framework was to set up a framework that allows any animal species to be looked at and to be mapped, the requirements for its welfare to be mapped against the framework. So within the framework there are different modules, and these modules are relevant for all animal species. And within each module there's an overarching outcome as effectively what are we seeking to do with the standards in this module. So as you see here, we've got the nutrition, where the aim is that we're ensuring that animals have sufficient feed and water to maintain health and prevent prolonged hunger or thirst, malnutrition or dehydration. For the living environment, it's an environment that provides the conditions and facilities for health, safety, comfort and normal behaviour. Animal management, which is quite often the biggest topic, because that's sort of all the management aspects that are going on, like the husbandry operations, which could include things like castration, or for other species, tail docking, disbudding, dehorning, and that sick or injured animals are treated. Handling and transport, that this is done with good human-animal relationships for handling, and handling and transport is done in a way that protects welfare. And then the whole management plans and procedures, which is allowing us to demonstrate that the standards that we have are delivering the welfare that we want to see. So that's sort of overarching, and then within the rest of this presentation, we're going to look at that in a bit more specific for alpacas. I'll have the next slide, please. So this is an example of the framework and how things map. And it's really just to show how there can be a lot of similarities between species. So the sort of working from the left, you can see there's the numbering is sort of largely irrelevant, but you've got an animal management topic. So the first one is inspection. You've got the animal management desired outcome, and then you've got the standards as they might be. So the first column, which actually lists a standard, is from the Responsible Wool Standard, and then the column on the far right is what this could be, for example, for alpacas. And the idea of this was to show that because we already have this framework and we already have the Responsible Wool Standard, there will be some standards requirements that will be exactly the same for sheep and for alpacas. How that's delivered on the ground and the challenges potentially to delivering that standard might be quite different, because the environments the animals are living in are quite different. But in terms of what are we looking for welfare, it might be exactly the same, or we might just be having minor changes in wording. And you can see the text in red here that obviously, well, for example, with sheep, we talk about increasing frequency of inspection at times of high risk of fly strike. This isn't really something that's a challenge for alpacas, so we don't need to talk about that. But the principle of saying that there's a sort of inspection frequency that's increased at times of higher risk, like giving birth, does remain the same. If I can have the next slide, please. So with nutrition, as I said, we've got that we're looking for access to sufficient feed and water for the animal's age and needs. There's a whole range of categories within this. Now, again, the categories that are given this slide are the categories in the main animal welfare framework. So that they may not be applicable to every species. So this has, for example, deprivation periods, which is something when we look at sheep, animals are quite often held off feed and water before shearing. So it's how much, whether we need to address that within the different species, but this is the sort of principle of it. If I can have the next slide, then we get into the specifics for alpacas. So as Callie has explained, alpacas are mainly being farmed at quite high altitudes, and the conditions can be very harsh. I mean, even in the better times of year, it's quite a difficult environment to be farming animals, and a lot of the native plants that are being grazed by the alpacas are small and low growing. And this was just a farmer in alpaca showing me a particular plant type that he was trying to promote for his alpacas. But if you're used to seeing sheep or goats in potentially much more lush pastures, this is quite a different type of vegetation that we're looking at here. And again, as Callie mentioned, alpacas are well adapted to these conditions of high altitude and the native vegetation that is growing there. But we're back to the same situation we have with any farmed livestock, that the number of alpacas that an individual farmer keeps and how their grazing is managed over the land area that they have will impact the ability of the animals to get the sufficient protein and energy from grazing in their diet. And again, the individual needs of an alpaca in terms of protein levels and energy might be quite different from a sheep, but it's still that challenge in that environment to make sure that they are getting the right nutrition. And there is, when you look nationally, again, some of this data is potentially now, this is sort of like the most recent data, so it may be a little out of date, and I know there are a lot of people working with alpaca breeders to improve some of these figures. But nationally in Peru, there's quite a low figure for pregnancy retention in females, so the number of females that will go on to have a baby, a cria, and you say there's sort of 45 to 50%, and it's thought that this is there's a variety of factors, but one of the key factors is ensuring that animals have sufficient nutrition throughout their pregnancy. So this is where we say that the principles of having the animal welfare framework and talking about nutrition being sufficient is the same across all the species that we deal with. But when we come to the specifics of alpaca, there may be some different factors that we need to make sure we're picking up within the standards and how they're managed. If I can have the next slide, please. So living environment, so again, this is animals kept in an environment that provides the conditions and facilities needed for health, safety, comfort and normal behaviour. And we have sort of an indoor environment and an outdoor environment within that, and all those then different factors within those two sort of living environments, and making sure that animals are protected from the elements, have good air quality, ventilation, light, sufficient space, And then outside any infrastructure, though, as Callie mentioned, there doesn't tend to be a lot of boundary fencing, for example, but where there is, that this is constructed in a way that does not cause any harm. Protection from predators, which can be an issue in Peru with some of the animals living alongside the alpacas, and all those different factors. So if I can go to the next slide, and we'll just talk through some of the key specifics for alpacas. So again, we're living at high altitude, and in some of the seasons going to be really severe weather. Can be snowstorms when the weather is so bad that the alpacas, really won't be going out to graze on the pastures. Alpaca farmers will all have areas where they can hold their alpacas off pasture, and some farmers, potentially, generally, I would say probably the bigger farmers, will have buildings. So it'll be much more like you see on perhaps sheep or goat farms, where the animals are mostly outside, but there will be some covered shelter that could be used. But quite often, this photo here, the sort of walls in the background, this, if you like, is the shelter. So when the weather is particularly bad, the alpacas are within these stone walls compounds, so they're getting an element of shelter from the wind from the walls, but there's not a roof over their heads. And there'll be a lot of the small farms that are in a very similar situation, where they won't actually have roofed areas. There's also with these, so that you then have the, say the alpacas are very well adapted. It might be possible to see, there's a couple of alpacas in this picture. It's unfortunately, it's quite dark. This it's an alpaca, yeah, thanks Callie. The one right at the front with a sort of a cape or a coat on, and there are a couple further back as well. And this was, some of the farmers would be identifying as sometimes this was their top animals with the best fibre, and they're wanting to keep them clean and protected, but also it would be smaller animals they felt were a bit weaker, that they would use these coats or capes to provide additional protection for the animals in weather that was unfavourable. So you have that as well. And then in the wet season, again, quite sometimes alpacas will be held in groups rather than ranging over the entire area that the farm has. And one of the issues with these sort of static shelters is they can get quite mucky. If you can imagine a lot of alpacas being held in close proximity in wet weather and treading the muck into the ground with the rainfall. Again, the farmers would tend to have several different compounds, so they could move alpacas, and if it was persistently wet, they always had somewhere that was reasonably clean, if not totally dry, to hold animals. The other one that was interesting, that some farmers were repurposing fishing nets and making temporary holding areas that they could move around in the wet season, so they never had to have the alpacas on a particular spot of the ground for more than perhaps a week or two at a time. So again, it's all these factors with looking at what's potentially quite an extreme weather situation for the animals, but having the right animal that is native to this area, and really its genetics are make it well suited to this area, but within the standards framework, making sure that we do have sufficient protection and their welfare is assured. If I can have the next slide, please. Now with animal management, this one here, you'll see there's a bit of strike through text on the left. And again, this was to show, I mean, animal management, as I said at the beginning, can be one of the larger topics, because we have all the husbandry operations. And again, the framework basically includes every possible husbandry operation that could be going on, some of which are just not relevant to alpacas. So they're shown here with strike through to show they're all considered as part of the framework, but we don't have issues of mulesing, for example, spaying, tail docking, disbudding, horn trimming, bill trimming, anything like that. Those are the very species specific requirements. we still could be talking about castration for alpacas, and obviously fibre removal, breeding, pregnancy, birthing, all those things are common across all the different species. If I can go to the next one and sort of look at this in a bit, sort of the general sort of animal management, and then I'll talk a little bit about health. So one of the topics we definitely will talk about and be looking at with the Responsible Alpaca Standard is the fibre removal and shearing. Now, obviously, an alpaca is a much larger animal than a sheep or a goat, so we've got a different challenge for the shearer to be able to handle and restrain the animal in such a way that it can be sheared safely, because obviously an animal that's moving around while you're trying to shear it is not good for either the shearer or for the animal. There is still some use of hand shearing, but the farmers are being encouraged to move towards the shearing with the electric clippers, and some of the larger companies that are working with the breeders and buying fibre have themselves trained up teams of shearers, and they'll be complete with all the equipment and generators, because obviously, as you can imagine, saying, oh well, everybody should just be using electric clippers can be quite a challenge in areas where there may not be a terribly good supply of electricity. So they will go out in the same way that you'll have contract shearers working for sheep and goats. Similar thing for the alpacas. It's people coming with the right equipment and the right training to carry out shearing. There has been research on how much stress alpacas are under, and some of the research has actually quite usefully looked at the act of shearing and the act of restraining the animal as well. And the research looked at with the shearing position of lying on the floor, lying on a table, or stood up. And the restraint in the standing position without shearing was the least stressful. But it was also noted by the researchers that this actually only works if the alpacas are calm during the shearing process. And there are, when you have very small numbers of alpacas, you'll have, where I am in the UK, there are people with very small numbers of alpacas, and the alpacas are more like pets than a commercial animal, and are used to being haltered and handled a lot. If you've got that kind of situation with an alpaca, you might be able to shear it standing up. But in commercial herds that are much more free ranging, and though they have a lot of human contact, because there's usually people out with them most of the time, but they're not necessarily being handled by people every single day, then the risk of injury by trying to shear with the animal stood upright may well be too great. And at that point, the restraint of lying the animal down was actually giving a better result. It's also noted, as happens in sheep systems as well, that shearing is often carried out during the last period of pregnancy, and obviously that's a point where careful handling is essential so as not to induce abortion. So this whole sort of what are the available methods and systems for shearing will be something we'll be looking at within the draft standard. Then with other points under the animal management topic, as I mentioned, castration, and as with many other fibre production systems, castrated males will be retained because they are still producing fibre each year. So say you get some systems which are more dual meat and fibre, then it can be a different scenario, but there will be a certain population of castrated males in a herd. And then, as I always seem to end up talking about death and castration, but with euthanasia, at the moment, the most common method of euthanasia is exsanguination, or effectively the animal has its throat cut. Those of you familiar with the responsible wool and responsible mohair standards will know that one of the things Textile Exchange tries to do is to say this should really only be a last resort scenario, and this will be, I think, one of the challenges we'll have as we're working with the alpaca breeders in Peru and elsewhere, is the availability of other suitable equipment. Though again, there's already some good, there are companies buying alpaca fibre who are working with breeders who are trying to look at alternative options and what can be done with breeders in these sort of remote areas. But again, as I say, we know this is a topic we'll be looking at within the standard. And then the next slide, please. And then on to health. So obviously the principle of the standard is that of the animal welfare framework is that the animals maintained in a state of good health, and that any sick or injured animals are treated as soon as that is those are identified. The internal parasites can be an issue, though. As Callie showed, there's a bit of a range. Even if we say alpacas are at higher altitudes or in the highlands of Peru, there's still a bit of a range of altitudes there, and in some cases you'll find alpacas and cattle being kept on the same farm, and things like fluke, which is a common internal parasite for cattle and sheep in certain areas, that at that point that can become a problem. But at higher altitudes this doesn't seem to be so much an issue, so you've very much got that where is the environment the animal's living in and the challenges there. Coccidiosis, again, which is another parasite that's soil-borne oocytes that can be a real problem with particularly young animals can be struck down with coccidiosis. There was quite a lot of use by of alpaca farmers and breeders by the natural and traditional remedies alongside veterinary medicine, and the pictures of the bowls at the bottom there, that was one particular farm with the different herbs, dried herbs and leaves and flowers that he was using, and actually the bowl on the bottom left, it is potatoes. You're probably looking at that thinking that looks like potatoes. It's some interesting. Peru does have incredible varieties of potatoes, but these were the very specific varieties of potatoes that he was using, this particular farmer was using as part of a traditional remedy as well. But equally there was going to the other extreme with some farms who were, for example, getting vaccines made specifically for the bug, the problem that they had on their own farm. So it wasn't even a generic, it was something that was being made specifically from them. So it was very interesting that there is this wide range from the sort of the traditional herbs through to quite technical veterinary medicine. I've noted here as well that pneumonia can be a challenge. In Callie's picture at the beginning, she was showing that the Suri alpaca has the much more open fleece or fibres, and there was some discussion with some of the higher altitude herds that they said, you know, if you keep the Suri alpaca up there, you really have to look after them, and they definitely need to have the coats because otherwise they'll suffer from pneumonia. And this really starts to feel like, you know, having the right animal in the right place and the right management to make sure those kind of risks are mitigated. The other one as well that, as Callie mentioned, there's not fencing. These farms don't tend to have their boundaries marked. The alpacas aren't, you know, they are freely roaming in a particular area, but that means they're freely roaming. The wild animals are also freely roaming, and there's a particular external parasite, the mange mite, which can be transferred between alpacas and the wild vicuña because they will sometimes share dust bathing areas. So there's again challenges there for the farmers to manage. And then the feet, the picture at the top just showing that the toes will, again like sheep, ongoing foot checks and foot care is needed. The toenails of the alpaca, they might not wear evenly, they can twist round and require trimming. Most farmers will do a teeth check and a foot check sort of prior to breeding and take any remedial action as needed through the year as well. So just all these factors, again, some of these things are very familiar from talking about other species, but it's might be handled a different way, and then there are sometimes some other challenges as well. have the next slide, please. So then handling and transport. I've put this photo in because you'll note the person who's sort of out of shot is holding that alpaca by its ear. Though actually I have to say the animal wasn't terribly stressed by that, but it was just sort of different methods of handling maybe going on, and the point of the standards is to set up a framework to make sure that all animals are handled calmly, and if they have to be held in one spot, I mean, this was looking at some fibre quality, that it's done in a manner that doesn't cause stress to the animal. And again, this is where we're going at with this one, is good human-animal relationships, and animals are handled and transported around the farm and off the farm in a way that protects welfare. If I can have the next slide. So the photo on the next slide. This guy is actually, again, this was a Surrey alpaca with a coat on to protect it, but he was actually using a rope halter just to hold the animal, and there was quite a lot of use of that as well. There's also quite a lot of movement on foot. Again, you might have the main farm, and the alpacas will be grazing, quite often accompanied by somebody, to be taken out to graze and moved around during subsequent days or weeks, and depending on what the weather's doing and the vegetation growth. And most of that's just on foot. It's not so much that you know, they're going to be loaded onto a farm trailer and moved anywhere. There is then, there will be movement of alpacas off the farm, so there might be older animals being sent to market, or some animals being sent for meat. And occasionally some of the vehicles that were being used that you could just see on the roads, again, this was in Peru, not all the transport vehicles were well designed, or they weren't specifically designed for alpacas. It was just a truck that alpacas might be put on. So again, this is the function of having the standard, as it starts to define what's expected when alpacas are placed onto a vehicle, and ensuring that their welfare is protected. And if I can have the next slide. And then this is really sort of the management plans and procedures, which again is sort of across all species, that the farmers have a clear strategy and a set of protocols to safeguard the welfare of their animals, and then they're able to demonstrate compliance to the relevant textile exchange standard. So in this case, that as we develop the Responsible Alpaca Standard, it's going to be auditing farms. The farms need to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting the standards, not just on the day that we happen, or the certifiers happen to go and visit them, but are able to maintain the standard between each audit and as part of their normal day-to-day management. So this one isn't really got any specifics for alpacas. It's just reiterating the same as we have for other species. And then if I can have my last slide. So then really as a summary, systems with high animal welfare potential are those that are where there's a husbandry system that can meet the animal's needs, that can provide for behavioural freedoms, and there's no compromise on the health of the animal. And with those sort of definition and thinking through from the 5 domains and the animal welfare frameworks and the outcomes we want to achieve, alpaca farming has got a really high animal welfare potential. You know, these are husbandry systems based on extensive grazing and free ranging, using an animal that is supremely adapted to its environment. But what we're talking about doing with the Responsible Alpaca Standards is ensuring that that high welfare potential is actually realised by having in place audited standards to ensure best practice from the farmers and to deliver good welfare for the alpacas, and to make sure that these points where I have sort of just pulled out a few potential issues for welfare are being mitigated for, and that we are confident in the supply of certified alpaca fibres. Thank you very much. That's me. I'm handing back to Hannah now.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Callie, for providing such a thorough overview of alpaca as a fiber and the animal welfare aspect of the development of the Responsible Alpaca Standard. So if we welcome anyone that is interested in joining our stakeholder list to send an email to responsiblewool@textileexchange.org, and we will include you in our communications so you can stay informed as we progress with the development. We will be scheduling further webinars and calls to look more closely at, for example, the land health aspect of the standard development. And for those that are interested in being more actively involved and joining the international working group, that's also very welcome. And just reach out to us on responsiblewool@Textile Exchange, and we can take it from there. So, because we're getting a few questions on the Q&A. What we will do is we will provide answers to the Q&A in the follow-up email from this webinar, so that everyone gets all the answers. So if there's something you think of in the next few hours, do send us an email when we include that in the follow-up as well. So thank you very much to Anna and Callie again for your presentations, and thank you to everyone that took the time to join this webinar. And we look forward to working with you on the Responsible Alpaca Standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and to our speakers for today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, all unanswered questions will be answered via email, and an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.